what you're describing, do you see an increase in incarceration rates or an increase in prosecutor success rates that's kind of consistent with this CSI effect?
Well, yes to the first point, but I'm not so sure in terms of the second. We certainly have seen increased incarceration rates. Again, I know of no studies that have addressed that issue. And I'd be hard pressed to say how many of those kind of cases exist. And again, part of the more realistic kind of problem, I suppose, that's producing some of my hesitancy is with so many cases that are pled rather than go to trial, it's not a moot point, but in some ways it almost doesn't matter. I mean, the defense attorney, the defendant may be aware that this kind of analysis has taken place, may see the report, but it never even gets to the court process. And how much that's influential in terms of pleas, I don't know. I don't know. Yeah?
Do you see a CSI effect on the criminals? For example, rubber gloves, latex, bleach, stuff like that?
There's not a lot of that. The reality is most offenders of most crimes do not operate very intelligently. We could argue that from the point of the decision to engage in the crime, but in terms of the execution as well. I mean, are there some? And again, I think motion pictures and TV tends to over-dramatize that as well. I mean, I have no doubts that there are some offenders that are much more careful about those kind of issues than they used to be, but I don't see that as a major kind of threat or concern in terms of how the habits of criminal offenders are really operating for the most part in practice. Yeah, Darren?
I'm not sure how to ask this concisely. Assuming that most law enforcement agencies have limited resources, first part of my question is how much of the forensic science that exists has actually trickled down into the procedures of collecting evidence and I don't know what you call for investigating a crime scene. How much of the science has actually moved into kind of the ordinary, very low profile, mundane cases, and has forensic science affected the way that work is done? Has the science itself, the development of the technique, affected training for police officers and detectives and anyone medical personnel who would be involved in a crime scene? To what degree is that?
Yeah, my sense is we've gotten better, but I mean, I'm not sure how dramatically we've moved in that kind of regard. And again, it's very hit or miss as well along those kind of lines. Again, particularly if you're talking about high stakes kind of cases, rape, sexual assault, homicide, we've improved pretty dramatically. And I think the issue there is more a matter of whether or not first responders on the scene are persons who have received enough training or are skilled enough to know that preservation is kind of the first thing that needs to be done. If, on the other hand, you have law enforcement who may come upon the scene or others who may come upon the scene and simply kind of walk in to see what's happened or investigate, you've got more problems along those lines. And I think, as you would suspect, larger, urban, more modernized, more well-resourced departments are going to be better towards that end of the continuum. Those that tend to be less well-resourced, more rural, are going to struggle or have more difficulties along those kind of lines. So we've moved towards that. Again, part of what the Academy calls for is more education, more training in terms of those kind of issues and along those kind of lines. Although, really, the heart of the report is not so much the collection of the evidence, it's what happens in terms of development of interpretation of those results or the analysis of those kind of results in the process.
I'm stuck back on this no standardization and oversight and accountability, and I'm wondering what factors you think play into that. Is it that it is a young discipline? Is it that many of the people most impacted by this discipline are people in society that are more marginalized than others? I mean, I guess I'm wondering, how is it that, yes, carpenters have standards by which they have to abide, but there's not within this particular field, which obviously is a weighty issues, sometimes life
Sure.
and death issues.
Yeah, my sense, and again it's a guess, is that it's largely historical, and the large part of it grows out of the fact that, again, even though what we're taught through history books and government classes is this kind of sense of a balance, and what many citizens will decry as too many rights for accused, or too many loopholes in the system related to the accused. A kind of system which is largely patterned towards this presumption of guilt and the processing of cases, a bureaucratic processing in terms of cases. How do we get rid of them as quickly as we can and decide what justice should be in that kind of sense? And a system that has largely grown out of, if you think all the way back to the Wild West and the frontier kind of days, has grown out of a sense in which power rooted in locals, power rooted particularly in prosecutors and in chiefs of police and sheriffs, is seen as a good thing, kind of low-level democracy in that sense. And given that, a kind of high degree of trust that those individuals are going to operate in our best interests largely being protection in terms of safety, stopping crime, not what do we do if somebody is falsely accused, and the balance is highly skewed in that kind of direction. And again, the resourcing and the kind of operations in terms of general assumptions and rules within the system operate on the basis of those kinds of things. And again, a kind of presumption, I suppose, of good faith that most prosecutors are pretty professional, they're pretty good. Most law enforcement officers work hard, do the best that they can under those circumstances. There are bad apples, but that's the way things deal with. And rooted in a largely political process. If you feel the prosecutor has done a bad job, vote him or her out in 4 years. If you believe that the chief that is not always, but largely appointed by the mayor is doing a bad job, then let the electorate speak under that kind of regard. And so there's, with that local-based system, there's not a lot of momentum or leverage towards state or national-based kind of issues or oversight. Indeed, the Academy recognizes that and kind of says, Congress can't really force this upon the states or force this locally. And so what they advocate, which I think has been a predominant strategy, Michael could comment on this more than I, through the purse strings, through funding, federal government can initiate a lot of changes, and through adopting or proposing a kind of best practice models to establish a sense of here's what we should all be striving towards, and some counties, some states, some jurisdictions will be farther away from that, and maybe they get more grants, they get